Hi, good afternoon. It's Dr. Michael McNeil here. Take two. I just tried to do this video and then forgot the name of some important philosophers. I thought, I better go and check those. So I want to talk a bit about analytical philosophy, and in a sense, because that's really connected with the background, in a sense, to my own project, and it's also it's the, in a sense, the dominant philosophical milieu of the 20th century in Anglo-American thought. Generally, that's not completely true, because there's definitely other streams. It's normally contrasted with what you would call Continental philosophy, which again is a very broad, that's a very sort of like broad brush, just as analytical philosophy is a very broad brush. The term Continental philosophy is equally as broad, but Continental philosophy is generally associated with the tradition which, in the 20th century at least, you'd have people like you have Heidegger and Sartre. They'll be very much can be considered sort of continental thought, and Lyotard later on, postmodern, would be thought of developing continental thought. It was originally associated with the continent of Europe, which is why it's got that label continental, but really it's anybody. If you've got, like in France, you've got, in Canada, you've got lots of people that migrated from Europe. So anybody that, any places where you've had concentrations of sort of Europeans who migrated, or so it's generally, both schools in many ways are subdivisions of what would even more broadly be called Western philosophy. And then you've got a completely separate block of thought which is associated with people generally call it Eastern philosophy. And Eastern philosophy, again, it's such a broad term, but most people, perhaps, if you wanted to try and generalize it to a degree, is that in the sense the Western tradition was much more rational or empirical, or uses rationality and empiricism. The Eastern tradition, people would say, it's much more intuitional. They would assume that there's a fundamental limitation to reason, and in order to really get in contact with reality, you have to make this sort of intuitive, you just encounter sort of reality, and the way you, in many systems of thought, the way you encounter this reality is to change your consciousness. So whether it's through transcendental meditation, or whether it's through chanting, or whether it's through taking on holy scriptures, or being in particular environments. So in a sense, it's not like a rational, talking about rationality most broadly there, it's not like a rational process. It's almost like there's some element of irrationality in that's how many people would characterize, in very crude terms, sort of like Eastern philosophy, whereas Western philosophy is much more, as again, using R, small r, it's concerned with rationality and the use of rationality. But that is interesting, because when you divide between, say, the continental schools and the what the analytical schools, which I want to concentrate on, some people would say that the continental school in some ways is moving more towards the intuition and the rational. Now the key in a sense, the key to understanding particularly modern analytical philosophy, which is generally associated with the 20th century. There was a revival in analytical philosophy in the very early years of the 20th century, and the philosopher that's most associated with that is somebody called G.E. Moore, and he was, in a sense, joined in his rebellion against Hegelianism by Bertrand Russell, who's one of the world's most famous philosophers that the world's ever produced, for all sorts of reasons. Very, very influential philosophically. And then in the second part of the 20th century, he died in 1979, but from say 1950 onwards, he became very much associated with social issues and anti-war issues, and he was jailed a couple of times for I think in the First World War he was jailed for distributing a leaflet on conscientious objection, and then I think even when he was 90, he was again in jailed for a short time because of he was accused of some sort of incitement to do with nuclear weapons, and so his life he had an enormous number of accolades for his life, but he was probably the most influential philosopher in the first, say from probably 1913, 1914 onwards till about 1950. His last major work, philosophical work, was published, I think, in around about 1950, and I think it was it called? I think it was the Human Knowledge, its limitations, and something like that. That was his last major work where he was in a sense still doing philosophy. He did like a lot of historiography of philosophy afterwards, so he wrote his History of Western Philosophy, although I think he published his first edition in the middle of the 30s, but I think he republished various editions of that, and he did some more sort of work which was more to do with autobiographical stuff and writing about social issues, and he really lost his influence within philosophy sort of probably around the 1950s as a philosopher who was really looked to and developed work. I mean, he expressed frustration, I think, in his autobiography, which I think was written probably in the mid to late 70s. He said he was just surprised that, he said, I just don't understand why people don't think I've got solutions to these problems, but why when I wrote this nothing happened. I've got solutions to these problems, why is nobody taking notice of me? So it's a little bit of a sad story in some ways, but he was very much more known for his social activism in the second half. But he and G.E. Moore were considered those who led the analytic philosophical revolution at the start of the century. Now, the reason why we need to understand that there's always been analytical philosophers, that it seemed to almost entirely disappear as a movement after, you would definitely say people like John Locke and David Hume, you would call them analytical philosophers, and so they're sort of like in the sense that Locke's early on, isn't he? He's probably early 17th century. Sorry, late 17th century. I keep getting confused between if I say 1700s, that might help. And then you've got you've got Kant and Hume as contemporaries. I was a Kant sort of like died in 1800, didn't he? I think. And so you got Hume writing all the way through the 1700s, up to about 1760, didn't he? I think for the last 10 or so years of his life, he said, I want to live remote from all clamour, because he'd been such a controversial figure. So he just basically, and he didn't publish his most controversial works on natural philosophy and natural religion. He waited until after he was dead, and one of his relatives or his son or somebody published the work because it was considered too incendiary. So it's a really interesting time of thought. Now, I did mention in a previous video that Kant was very much considered the turning point of Western philosophy, and so and Kant obviously sort of published his main works sort of from say late 1770, I think 1778 maybe his first edition of the Critique, and then he did his three critiques critique trilogy, and then he in some ways revisited those in the latter parts of his life until he was able, in I think the last couple of years, he became so ill and mentally impaired, almost people that he didn't, he couldn't do much significant work in the last couple of years of his life, but he remained pretty active and involved in teaching and communicating with people up until that point. And I think there is quite a poignant story. Somebody goes to visit him just shortly before he before he sort of like really lost his ability. Dementia became too bad, and he actually said to them, he said to them, "Sir, I'm still able to appreciate the good and the bad things of life." He said, "I'm not that far gone that I can't still appreciate." But his major work was all. Some of it was published, I think, after some, and there's been some work of Kant's work which has only been published very, very recently. It's like it's opus posthumen, I think. It was only done in there. That was, and the whole thing is like, that was him revisiting some of the themes of the critiques, and he'd started to revisit them, I think, in the early 1790s, but had never sort of completed. So this is sort of, there's still Kant scholars who were involved in getting his work so that people can really see how his thought, because people tend to just think of Kant in terms of the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment, which is to do with aesthetics, I think, isn't it? And so they tend to think of him like that, and they don't tend to think, well, there was actually a lot of other work that flowed out of that, in response to people not really understanding his work and criticism of that work. He did have a whole block and body of work which flowed out of that, but his key thought was he was trying to deal with the problems of rationalism and empiricism, and trying to deal with the skepticism of Hume. He didn't want to. Hume was just basically destroyed the possibility of knowledge, and so Kant divided reality into the phenomenal realm, which was the realm of science. And so he wanted to save science. He wanted to make it possible that natural science, he was thinking of, when he talks science, he's really thinking of natural science, of observing phenomena, the physics. He was interesting enough, Kant did quite a lot of work in natural science in his early work. He did quite a lot of physics and optics, and he'd written a couple of treatises early on in his life. So he was somebody that had come, that was the background to his very early work. I think it was in the 1730s, 1740s, and then he'd moved into he'd been, I think, in teaching positions or there, but then he encountered the work of Hume, and it said that Hume had awoken him from his dogmatic slumbers, which is a posh way of saying Hume, intellectually, Hume's skepticism and Kant found alarming, and he wanted to try and answer it in some way. And so his answer, if you can call it an answer, again, this is to call it an answer is a Kant scholars and philosophers will argue forever, I think, over whether Kant ever answered Hume, or whether he just reflected Hume's answer back to him as an answer. Whether he just reflected Hume's, because Hume his conclusion was that causality, if you like, is just a habit of the mind. So causality, which is the basis of, say, natural science, is the basis of induction. You can't, if you think that A causes B, Hume very astutely actually said that, actually all you see is you see a certain sequence of events. You never see causality itself. This thing called causality, which we might want to call a transcendental, that makes your understanding. So that's how Kant would describe, causality is like a transcendental, which helps you understand, makes possible understanding. But Hume had basically said, well, if I just proceed on empirical presuppositions, then that there is no such thing as causality. I'm seeing events, and so I'm just seeing. So my knowledge, if you like, or things I call knowledge, are just habits. They're habits. Of causality is purely a habit of my mind. And Kant looked at that and said that that almost destroys the possibility of science. So his solution was to divide reality into what's called the phenomenal realm. So phenomena is the realm of nature, and that's the realm in which we can do science in. So and what's called the noumenal realm. Now the noumenal realm is, he says, that's where you would experience, that's where things exist as things in themselves, but we only experience things as they appear to us. But those are when we're dealing with phenomena, those things are appearing to us in a particular way. But there's no guarantee that we're actually in contact with those things. That's an important distinction to understanding Kant's thoughts. He was saying there's things as they are in themselves, which exist in the noumenal realm, which which is beyond our reach. It's beyond the reach of intellect, of reason. But he did believe that he posited that there was a noumenal realm, and that's the realm of God. That's the realm of ethics. That's the realm of So that, in a sense, there's those are things which are necessary and useful for us as posits. So God's a useful posit to guarantee, if you like, the moral. He had what was called the moral argument for God. In the end, our experience of life is only made sensible if there's God. It's a specific form of argument for God, because he was one of the first to slice and dice the ontological argument and the cosmological and teleological arguments, but he did feel that the concept of God and in a sense that role that God would say play in the moral, of ensuring that eventually the person who moral and who did their duty, that was thinking that if he was trying to say that injustice could not be like an eternal injustice. At some point there would be a correction, because God would be the one that's guaranteeing the moral fabric of the universe, and that's, in a sense, that's called the sort of like the moral argument. It's whether that argument was successful or not. Many people would say it was not. I mean, particularly in its successes, people would just say the argument failed. I think the book that I recommended in one of my first talks, it's got a section. It goes through those arguments, all those different forms of arguments, and then it says the failure of the argument. So it says the ontological argument, the failure of the ontological argument. Now that's an opinion whether or not they think they failed, because there is a form of the ontological argument that Alvin Plantinga formulated, where he would say, well, this argument is actually this is a triumphant form of the argument, but equally, I think Alvin Plantinga also said that it was a bit like saying, but we can't make any progress in natural theology, even if this argument is considered a valid form of the argument, because an argument can be valid, but that doesn't mean that it's actually establishing anything, or it's true, or it's proving anything. It's just there's a difference between an argument having a valid form and it actually being like an argument that proves anything true or proves anything about the world. So that's a matter of logic, which I want to get onto today. So that's just sort of like a bit of a historical background to that sort of like flow. The 19th century in particular was a series of reactions to Kant, and some people sort of accepted, said reason. They said reason's limited. If we really want to know anything about getting to the noumenal realm and experiencing in the world as it is in itself, and particularly in the sense, if you like, the metaphysics of that, because obviously when Kant, not necessarily obviously, when Kant divided the phenomena, the two realms into phenomenal and noumenal, he said that at noumenal realm we can't know cognitively, we can't know by reason. So he'd become like a metaphysical skeptic at that point. He said reality is in itself, we're separated from that. We only experience reality as it appears to us in the phenomenal realm. And so in a sense was metaphysical skeptical, but he wasn't an atheist. That's the thing. Kant was very concerned with the atheism of Hume as well as the philosophy of Hume. He was concerned with the atheism of Hume, and there's quite a lot of interesting work which is less appreciated, I think, in Kant's scholarship, simply because it deals with Kant's attitude to religion, and I think it's one of his most famous. He did a couple of very quite famous books regarding moral philosophy and like prolegonomer to the future metaphysic, and another one that's a little bit harder to get hold of is his Religion Within the Bounds of Reason, which has some fascinating parts of it. There's no doubt about it. Some of his because he was trying to say what when you say religion within the bounds of reason, what's a reasonable religion. It's almost in some ways almost like a contradiction of terms that it would be, but he was trying to say, well, but there are some sections of that book. I can remember when I read it for the first time, or at least read sections. I don't think I've read the whole thing through. Any reading of Kant at all, it's a bit like people call it like a rite of passage. If you ever try and read the Critique of Pure Reason, if you get past, say, the introduction and 70 pages in, if you manage to do that, that's, you're in a league of superior philosophers or something. People find it hard because his language is very dense. The sentence structure's contorted. So that's the Continental flavour. If you read Continental Philosophy, you can quickly become bogged down in the language. It can be very technical vocabulary, and so that's why, in a sense, why I want to talk eventually. I'm supposed to be talking about analytic philosophy, but I think that historical stuff is really, really handy, really useful to actually understand that Kant's considered his turning point, and people came out from Kant. So some people went into the intuitive route, people like Schopenhauer, and who really started to emphasise the subjective. And Schopenhauer was interesting because he took quite a lot of his inspiration from. He'd been involved with Indian philosophy quite a lot. He'd been in Congo, I think he'd travelled or something, or been with the German. I don't know if he'd volunteered with the German army. They'd been in India. There's some interesting thing in Schopenhauer's history. There's people with that who took like the more intuitive route. That if you want to get in contact with reality as it really is in itself, i.e. the noumenal, we're going to have to intuit, and we're going to have to, So in a sense, you're not trying to argue and trying to convince people in the sense with you're just saying. Schopenhauer was quite interesting because he said that if you say the right thing, if you say like write a philosophy and you say the right thing, and it's right, people are just going to read my philosophy and they're going to go, wow, yes, he's got it. You're going to have this. It's a bit like when if you write and you're trying to write about something and you're trying to report something or something, and often as a writer you will read what somebody else has said about something, and sometimes you'll read something that somebody else has wrote and you'll go, yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. That I was trying to wrap my words and wrap my language around those concepts, and they've got it. That was it. They've got it. And Schopenhauer was very much of that view. He believed that his philosophy, when people would read it, they would suddenly go, yeah, he's got it. Yeah. So because you can't argue because it's noumenal, it's something over in the noumenal, so you can't get yourself there, but you're expressing, and you find this thought, I think, a bit in Continental philosophy that I think is a bit like Lyotard. I tried to quote Lyotard a little bit in my thesis, but one of the examiners said basically being polite. He was much more polite than this, but he said you don't really know what you're talking about on this particular when you're trying to talk about postmodern Lyotard's postmodernism. You're not being, because I think I think yes, because I'm far more an analyst, analytical philosopher than I am in the Continental school. Yes, so I'm happy to say that yes, I'm not a Continental philosopher, but he said I'd misrepresented Lyotard to a degree. But what I would say, I think I am representing Lyotard accurately here when I say that, because I'm quoting him at this point. Whereas one of Lyotard's quotes was that you are going to be trying to, when you're sort of doing philosophy and you're trying to write, you're trying to describe in language something that's already happened, and how your language, because of the ambiguous nature of language and the lack of clarity, and you're almost like falsifying what you're trying to describe in language. And so in many ways that's sort of like the stream of Continental thought. So people came out from Kant who wanted some sort of intuitive, subjective contact. The work of Kierkegaard was very influential in this degree, which sort of out of Kierkegaard and flowed. Sartre basically secularized Kierkegaard, and you had the existentialist movement, and in the early 20th century you also had what was called the phenomenology, which is an interesting movement in itself, because it was trying to return to a view of philosophy which dealt with the big questions, and it wanted to get back in contact with a real world. And I'm trying to remember the name of the most important phenomenologist who I will remember at some point. But what came out of his work, in some ways people said, well, because phenomenology wanted to say there's publicly accessible reasons, there's a publicly accessible world, there's an objective world, there's reasons which are publicly accessible. Whereas existentialism, which came out of phenomenology, Husserl, that was the person I was thinking of. Husserl was who wrote the phenomenology, the big treatise on phenomenology, but the difficulties that they had in making that case, people said, no, actually, there's no public reasons for things. The best things you can come up with for trying to explain the world is to have your own come to your own personal conclusions, and that's what existentialists were concerned with. It was talking about living authentically. So we, in our 20th century culture, particularly sort of like in the West, very much in the Anglo-American, we have great sympathy, or when somebody actually says, I might have done it wrong, but I did it with all my heart. They're doing it with all your heart, that authentic, even if somebody's wrong, in scare quotes, even if somebody's later proved wrong or something, if they did it with their best heart intentions, to the best of their ability, we're really prepared to cut them some slack, which is to say, yeah, that person really, even though say, for me as a young punk in years gone past, Sid Vicious, he lived his life the right way. He only lived until he was about 21, but man, did he have 4 years of, yeah. You know what I mean? People will tend to do that. We'll tend to do that with cultural icons, won't we? We even though they might have died very horribly of heroin overdose or something, said, yeah, but they lived authentically. And that's, if you like, a bastardization of the existentialist sort of view. You've just got private reasons for your life. That's all you can ever have. You can't have any of these horrible big meta-narratives and these religions and systems that try and tell you the right way to live. You've just got to discover for yourself the right way to live. And that's, in a sense, the continental sort of stream. All that sort of stuff comes out that really, in many ways, is very individualistic. There's no sort of big public answers. By public answer, all I mean by public answer is it's an answer that it's accessible to anybody. It's a bit like saying truth. Truth is what is true for everybody. That's like in many ways the continental school sort of denies that public aspect of truth, or it weakens it, or it tries to. People tend to talk about things like your truths and my truths, and but that's, in a sense, as an analyst, I will say people are that's a nonsensical to say my truth and your truth. That's nonsensical because truth is that which is true for me and true for you. But that's what I'm trying to get to the point of talking about once I get past all this wonderful history. But it's really important to see these themes as they run through, because you can see how this has affected our culture and it's affected our way of looking at life, and that's why I mentioned this, because the philosophies of the 19th century and the philosophies of the 20th century have very dramatically affected our political life and our social political life and our economics, and so it's important to understand what the assumptions of these of these schools were. And if you understand what the assumptions of schools were and their motivation for doing why they're doing, then you actually understand why we are living in the society that we're living in, which, you know, is one of my motivating themes that I'll return to again and again, is that your philosophical view and where you decide philosophically where you are, that's going to have an enormous influence on the entire rest of your life. And it's so important to tie together, right? This is the metaphysics, this is the metaphysical assumptions, this is the view of the universe these people have got, this is the way they've defined how we know true or false, how we know things, and then that's out of that springs, right, this is the way we should live our life, or the way we believe we should live our life, this timetable. I return to that sort of theme again and again. Okay, so I think I'll have a short break here.